Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome again to our study of ancient Greece. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Athens. Athens is the city-state associated with wisdom. The goddess Athena is its patron goddess. And while we're doing it, I just want you guys to think about how it compares to Sparta. And we'll definitely do that more so in class. But just have it in the back of your mind and think. Okay, guys, on your sheet, I did forget to write your key questions down for you. Actually, I usually do them as objectives, but this is okay if you could just write them down for me. But some of the things I want you to be thinking about as we're going through this is how are contemporary democratic governments rooted in the classical traditions that we see set up in Greece. So meaning what that means is how are today's democratic governments based on what we see happened in ancient Greece, particularly in Athens. We want to look at what impact Greece is going to have on later political systems and how they develop, mainly that of the United States. And I do want to quickly say to you guys, if you want, pause on this stuff if you need longer to write it, because I might go faster than I realize when I'm just talking. So certainly pause it if you feel like you need to. We're also going to look at how the institution of slavery, which is ripe in Athens, not just Athens, but pretty much every Greek city-state, and how they actually reconcile that with the fact that they are a democratic society. So that's an interesting question, because it's also one that the United States will have to wrestle with in its history, and you guys are well aware of that, I'm sure. So these are the key points that I want you guys to be thinking about, and the things that you'll have to be able to really explain, or at least touch upon, when we go through this, okay? So I'm going to move forward, but again, if you need time, just pause it here. Okay. In terms of how we're going to see democracy develop in Athens, what we have to realize is that originally Athens was ruled by monarchs, kings, and that rule kind of gradually subsided and became an aristocracy. So when we talk about the old philosophers like Plato firmly believed in the aristocracy ruling. The aristocracy are the people who are the wealthiest landowners. So aristocrats are typically wealthy landowners. They are the ones who control most of the resources of the population and control most of the land of the population. And typically they're educated people, which is what what Plato is actually talking about. He's talking about people who are educated and who are propertied. So this idea is one that you're going to see later on that Plato is very much in love with, okay? And so he believes very strongly in this aristocracy. But what happens in this aristocracy is that the very poor people start to get angry and resentful, which I'm sure we can understand. Because there's a huge disparity. The word disparity just means a gap, a giant gap. And the disparity between rich and poor causes a lot of problems because there's really nothing in between. There's no middle class. And for much of history, that is an issue because, when you look at a situation like that, who's going to have all the power, right? You're probably thinking in your head right now, the rich. The rich are going to have all the power, and you're absolutely right because they control the resources. Now, to kind of bring some calm to this chaos, we get a new leader, and his name is Draco. Now, if you're Harry Potter fans, you know that Draco is not a nice character. And so when you look at that name, you can see the origins of it kind of help you think about how the actual Draco of ancient Greece ruled. He came up with what was called the Draconian Code, and they were extremely harsh laws and harsh punishments so that they would dissuade people from getting out of line, essentially. So he enacts these really harsh laws, and again, it's called the Draconian Code, basically designed to keep conflict to a minimum. So he's trying to rule with an iron thumb. If you think back to what we talked about with China, think about what was the system called when you were supposed to rule as harshly as possible and keep the people in line with that harshness rather than letting them think they could take advantage. If you're saying legalism, you're awesome, I love you, okay, but you're right. Draconian law is very much like the legalism that we looked at in China. Now, after Draco, you're going to get Solon in power. He is going to take away some of those draconian laws. Now, draconian, people will use that word today. So if you hear someone say that something, or they describe something as draconian, they're talking that it's very, very cruel, it's severe for no real reason. So that term has actually entered the vernacular, the language of today. So if you hear someone say that, they're referring back to the fact that this Draco had such harsh laws. And so when you hear somebody say that, draconian, or if you want to use that in an essay for English, score some brownie points, alright, they're talking about being unnecessarily harsh. He's going to revise these laws and make them less so that they're easier, I shouldn't say easier, but that they're less severe in terms of punishment. They're not unnecessarily harsh. Okay, so he's really going to be an early forefather of making things a little more pleasant for the poor. Okay. In terms of seeing how all this aristocracy is going to evolve now into a democratic government, it starts again with Solon. He allowed all Athenian men to take part in the government assembly, which was unprecedented, okay? This does help to calm things down and to make the poorer classes less resentful and less angry, but it does not end the conflict. Okay, so Solon is starting to make progress towards it. In 541 BC, you see Pisistratus actually seizes power, and he is going to go back to being more like Draco. Okay, he rules as a tyrant. A tyrant is someone who, longs for absolute control and is unnecessarily cruel and does not allow personal freedom. So Pisistratus is going to go back towards that draconian style. Cleisthenes, who's going to come to power after Pisistratus, he is going to go back more towards what Solon started as his way of making the country more democratic, although obviously they didn't have these words, this terminology at that point. But demo and cracy, right? Demo means people, crazy means government, so the government by the people. Cleisthenes is trying to bring about more of these changes. So really, he's the one we refer to as like the father of Athenian democracy. Now, there's something about Athens and being democratic that we have to look at. Like the Spartans before them, they allow slavery. And most of the time, this slavery comes from people being captured in war, but also kidnapping was rampant. So especially with young women. Neighboring countries like Syria especially, people were kidnapped and sold into slavery. So it's not that they're all coming from war. Some of it does also result from kidnapping. What we have to understand is that slavery wasn't looked at as a moral evil at this point in history by pretty much any society. Most societies felt that it was the spoil of war, or that it was a natural state for some people to live in and a way to keep order. Aristotle, who we'll learn about a little bit later on, but he's another philosopher like Plato, he actually came out and wrote about this, and he defended slavery and said that it's actually a way to keep order among the people. He did make a distinction. He did say that there's a difference between slaves who are slaves by nature, meaning they're bred into slavery, the children of the slaves who come after the initial slave, and then there are the slaves of war, the ones who are captured because of battle. So he did make some distinction, but he did not criticize the institution at all. He, in fact, defended it and said that it was a way to keep order in the society. So what we see is that most Athenian slaves were actually captured, but those people then had children, and their children became slaves, and so you're talking about them literally being bred in slavery, being bred in captivity and living their lives in that way forever. And then, that's what your family is going to have. So there were people who did criticize slavery, but they don't oppose it. They don't try to get rid of it. They don't think that it's a moral evil, that it's wrong to necessarily treat these people this way. So we have to keep that in mind. It's very difficult to think about it, because we've always lived in democracy in our lifetimes, that would look at this as an absolute aberration, a terrible thing to do, but it's not how it's always viewed in history, and certainly not in Athens at this time. In fact, it was a sign of status. If you were well-to-do, you would have 2 or 3 slaves, whereas if you're wealthy, you could have 20 or 30. There was actually the wealthiest man in Athens, at the height of his slave-owning days, he owned 1,000 slaves, and what he would do is rent them out to people in the community. So, having these slaves was actually a status symbol in some ways, and you strove to achieve that so that you would not have to do the work. When you read, like Xenophon writing plays, when you read some of his works, you'll see, like, there's passages in it where he's actually talking about how you need to hire a slave so that you don't have to do any of the work, and that's a status symbol. So for them to own these slaves, again, is not looked at as morally wrong. It's looked at as a status symbol, that you're wealthy, that you can do this. So it's hard to reconcile that with the idea of a democracy. But as we look at how this democracy actually operates, I think you guys will see that you can see why it is like this. Because in terms of true democracy, Athens is not a full democracy. Okay, and we'll look at that in a second. Okay, in terms of it evolving, what we have to look at is the fact that when you're talking about Athenian democracy, what you're really talking about, the people who are taking part, okay, are free male Athenians who are over 20 years old and who have completed military training. Those are the people who can vote. Okay, so right away they're excluding several groups in society. Clearly they're excluding the slaves, which is understandable in terms of how slavery works and how they viewed slaves as property, not as, people who have minds and can vote. You're also obviously alienating the women. The women have no say over this type of government whatsoever. It is only males who can do and participate in the government. You're excluding people who are, in our country, say we allow kids to vote at 18. You're excluding people who are younger than 20. You're excluding anyone who is male and has not had military training. So these things make it a lot more conditional than most people realize. Okay? By the 300s BC, what you're really talking about participating in this democracy are 10% of the population total. Not a high amount, a high percentage of the population of the country. This is what we refer to as a direct democracy. Okay, this is the closest thing in history to true direct democracy, which is where everyone gets a vote and gets a say. Again, by these parameters, you clearly see that not everyone in the entire society, but everyone that's eligible has the same amount of say. They participate directly in their democracy. So the vote is taken and whatever is decided there is done. That is direct democracy with direct citizen participation. The way the Greeks set this up is they had a tricameral system, basically 3 main bodies, 3 houses, like we would call them houses. They had an assembly. The assembly made the laws. And this is where you would have people who were, going in and participating in the assembly. They were not elected people. It was anyone who was over 20, male, not a slave, who had completed the military training. Anybody was in the assembly there. Okay? Then from the assembly you would have the Council of 500, and those people then wrote the laws. You also had the court system, which is where they dealt with trying and sentencing the criminals. So anyone who was outside of the law, the Athenian code, which had again evolved from what Solon was doing after Draco's code. Anybody who violated those laws would be subject to going to the courts and being tried and sentenced for their crimes. So this is the basic structure of the Athenian democracy. So you see that though it is a direct democracy where everybody is able to participate in the assembly, the group that makes the laws, not everyone in the society is actually participating in democracy to begin with. Okay? Now, people who were elected, okay, had special roles in the government. Okay? You would elect generals, and they would come from the army, obviously, and they would lead the city into a war. So they had special roles in this whole democratic process. And then you had what was called the Archon. He is elected. Okay? He is the chief of state. He would serve a 1-year term. Okay? So the Archon, if you were to equate him to somebody in our democracy, what role do you think he would have? And forget the term, just think about his actual job, chief of state. You would be talking then about the president. I'm sure you're seeing that in your head. So the Archon is like the equivalent of our president. Okay? Differences, serves a 1-year term, is elected by a very small percentage of the people. As you guys see, there's only about 10% of the people total participating in this direct democracy. But once elected, he was chief of state and would tell the generals what they were doing and things like that, and served a 1-year term. So this is the basic framework of Athenian democracy. What we're going to be doing in the next few days is discussing how Athens and Sparta are similar and different, okay? And then we'll talk about some of the other city-states, just some interesting points, and we'll definitely focus a lot on Athenian and Spartan, all kinds of Greek contributions to the arts, to philosophy, to architecture, and those types of things. So very important that you understand. So when you look at the Athenian democracy, you can see that in its roots, it does provide a lot of the structure that we're going to see in the American democracy much later on. So the Athenians have definitely influenced what the United States will do, and certainly another civilization that's going to come in shortly after them will see what it does in terms of influencing the Romans, because you're going to see some influence there, though the Romans will actually be more like ours, so they might more heavily influence the American democracy. But traditional basic beliefs of democracy come out of Athens, which makes it very influential in the course of world history, beyond the scope of just the BC times and Global One. Also, it echoes right through all the way up to the present day. So a very important period in history. I hope that you've enjoyed this, okay? And I can't wait to see you guys in the next couple of days, because you'll probably do this over the weekend. So I'll be waiting to see you on Monday. Have a great night, and thanks for listening.